Welcome on behalf of Adobe and our partner, the Content Marketing Institute, to today's webinar, 5 Prescriptions for Attracting and Engaging Your Audience. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Joe Polizzi is an entrepreneur, speaker, author, podcaster, and father and lover of all things orange. He's the founder of multiple startups, including the Content Marketing Institute, the leading content marketing educational resource for enterprise brands.
Alma, thanks so much. Super excited to be here today. It is my pleasure to introduce my good friend and good friend of myself and CMI and Adobe Connect, Mike Agron. Mike is a webinar demand generation expert, author, co-founder, and executive webinar producer for WebAttract. Last week, Mike was one of our featured speakers at Content Marketing World 2015. Thank you, Mike. And after 25 years in high tech with such firms as Apple, Oracle, and MapInfo, he's learned how to help brands and media publications use webinars to reach new markets and audiences, especially those that want to promote their thought leadership and attract fresh, new sales leads. If you're not familiar with WebAttract, they are a professional service and training organization that helps B2B sales and marketing professionals associated with global and emerging brands, as well as media publishers, excel at using webinars across the entire life cycle. And I can second that because I think this is Mike and my 8th or 9th webinar together, so I'm excited about this. Mike's super passionate about helping clients through webinars and meeting their commercial outcomes. And live from beautiful Sacramento, California, welcome, Mike, and it's so good to have you on board, and I just saw you last week.
Yes, indeed it is, Joe, and it's great to hear your voice and see you after a wonderful week, and I'd like to thank Alna and the rest of the folks at Adobe Connect for having us back, and especially everybody in the audience. We wouldn't be here if you weren't here, so as Joe said, we're super excited to have you. That's my actual license plate on the left, and I bring that up because you can call me a webinar nerd, but I eat, breathe, and love webinars. It's what we do. And in fact, part of the reason is because it's just a wonderful opportunity to tell a great story with real business outcomes. I've had the privilege of having a front center seat to hundreds of companies with different use cases. And it's really been exciting to learn a lot of different topics and how webinars are used. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is how you can use webinars in a way that makes it more than just content, breathing life into content. I think webinars are very theatrical, and I always like to use the metaphor of thinking of a radio show, but with pictures. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And as Joe said, there's lots of different use cases for webinars. What I'm going to be focusing on today is how you can use webinars more for demand generation and generating leads. But that means you have to be able to attract and engage an audience that's going to find value in your message. And that way you can then get into a sales process and find out who of them are really prospects and can become your customers. So here's what we're going to be talking about today, having a little fun with prescriptions. I've come up with 5 prescriptions that if I had to prioritize, what are the top 5 things that I can share with our audience that will help you better attract and engage your audience, it's these 5 things. So just a moment, we're going to talk about how do you pick a winning topic that really connects with your audience. And as important is how do you use metrics and KPIs to validate if you're on track, and if you're not on track, how do you make corrections? And then there's the always fence sitters. How do we get those stragglers to register? And then as important is to make sure your speakers who are the rock stars, and coming from Cleveland last week when we were at the Rock and Roll Museum, we certainly saw our share of rock stars, but speakers are rock stars too. And we want to give you some tips on how you can make them shine by using what we call table reads and dress rehearsals. Again, it's a very theatrical production. And finally, how do you use the life cycle intelligence that I'm going to show you that should be collected before, during, and after the webinar for post-webinar follow-up. So those are the 5 things, and I want to get through these and give everybody time to have at least 10-15 minutes of Q&A. And also, these are all based on actual examples. And if there's something that you'd like additional information on, shoot it into Joe. He'll let me know. But these are the top 5 things that I want to go with for now. And my goal is, whether you're an experienced veteran at doing webinars or you're brand to doing webinars, I want you to walk away with something that will help you make your webinars even more effective and successful. But in order to do that, I wanted to let you know that there is some complimentary content. Everybody who's attending will be able, at the end of the webinar, we'll give you an opportunity to get a copy of my new book. It's free. It's called The Art of Producing Webinars That Work. And it's really based on 140 quotes. It's a social media enabled way of learning. It'll give you some good ideas to reinforce what we talked about today. And also, there's a great study, if you don't have it, that Content Marketing Institute and Adobe Connect did about a year ago on webinars, talking about they're not just for leads anymore. So let's move to learning more about you. I'd like to launch the first poll, Alna, and what I want to know is, how many webinar invitations do you receive a week? And this is always a fun exercise to do, and it's going to help me not only learn about how many invitations you receive, but we'll use this throughout my presentation to reinforce some points. So Joe, I know you and I wouldn't be against a little wager. Do you want to guess which one of these is going to come up number 1, or do you want to hold until all the votes are in? What would you say?
That's interesting. Well, if I was speaking from personal account, I would have to say I've lost count. But I would say that it's got to be somewhere between, I would say 4 to 5. That's where I'm leaning at. But I think I'm weighting heavy because there's so many webinar invitations going out these days, and it's hard to find the quality. And that's why I think I'm interested to hear how we can cut through the clutter with some of these email messages.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think, it looks like just about everybody who's voted has. If you want to go ahead and in the poll, and let's share the results and take a look. We can now see. So what I'm showing is that the majority of you, or actually half of you, get 1 to 3 invites a week, and about 35% get 4 or 5. And Joe, you're in that group of about 10% that have lost count, and some of you don't get any. But I think this makes an important point that there's as Joe said, there's a lot of clutter. There's a lot of information that comes through there. So if you can't cut through somebody's inbox to rise above the noise, there's no chance that you're going to be able to attract them, yet alone engage them. So let's move on and start talking about some of the things that are important. And I always have to set the stage. Can you relate by looking at this? This is a goat rodeo. Webinars don't have to be a goat rodeo, and so often they are, and I think that has a lot to do with why webinars aren't always as effective as they should. But there is a methodology to the madness. And when you think about all the things you as a webinar producer have to balance at one time, you've got business drivers, you've got logistics, you've got the human factors of your audience and of your speakers. You've got technology issues from the webinar hosting platform, email marketing, audio. There's a lot of things that you have to balance. And so getting it right by being able to zero in and attracting the right audience with the right message is absolutely critical. And again, it is a 5-act play. And the different acts are from setting the stage to do a planning, which I think is the most important part, to attracting the audience, tracking metrics, going into what's called table reads and dress rehearsals, going live with the final sound check, and what do you do after the webinar? I'm going to talk about some of these, but to put it out in another way, to manage the webinar lifecycle in wanting to go beyond your house list, from let's go to go live, there's probably 8 weeks. These are all the different activities that have to be done, and I'm going to hit on some of the highlights. And if I'm not mistaken, we do have a copy of this presentation for you, so you can study it after the webinar. But you also have to have, and the most important part is a production script and a framework, and there's 3 parts. The first is a deadline-driven methodology, a way of approaching what's happening each of those weeks. And then there's a set of best practices that cut across the webinar lifecycle, and of course, metrics and analytics, because if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? How do you know what the results are? So I'm going to talk about using KPIs and a lot of these others in analyzing your campaigns. The first prescription is, I think, the most important, and that's how do you pick a winning topic that connects with your audience. The most important thing to remember, and particularly today, is that your attendees are on a journey. They're not necessarily sales ready. They're interested in learning how they can get better outcomes. They have questions, how to overcome pain points, or they're actively looking for a solution. Remembering that they're on a journey is the most important thing, because the time to sell is after the webinar, not during it. And when it comes to selling, whether we like it or not, people buy when they're in pain and they have the money to solve it. So if you think about that, is your topic and content a must-have or a nice-to-have? I would say that a must-have is going to have people spend money on painkillers. A nice-to-have is vitamins. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but people just don't have time today to attend something that's a nice-to-have. And part of where this pain comes from is there's so much confusion and change in the environment. Markets are being disrupted. There's shifts in the industry, but that creates the opportunity for you to separate and rise above the pack and show your thought leadership and your expertise on how you can help people solve their problems. Again, it allows you to go beyond sound bites and tell stories. You can highlight innovative solutions. So I embrace change. I embrace confusion, because to me that's an opportunity. Now, when it comes to B2B webinar themes, there's 3 that really attract and engage an audience, and I'm going to give you some examples. The first is a case study, and a case study deals with a success story of a company that had a vexing problem, that described what their use case was. They had options. They chose something. They implemented it. They got demonstrable business results. There were lessons learned. They tell you how to get started. It's not about products, pricing, and features. It's about real business value. Then the other type is a tutorial, kind of like what we're doing today. It's how to. How do you do something? And the third, which is really powerful with all the confusion and change, is changes in standards and compliance. So let me give you some examples of some high-performing webinar topics, and then I'm going to go into some metrics in a moment. But if you look at this, there are various brands across the B2B marketscape, and they all were able, all of these webinars here outperformed their expectations. The first one, for example, is by Dex One Media, and this is a company that for many years published the yellow pages. They needed to get into digital marketing, and they needed to show their customers that they had ways of helping them. So they did we did a webinar called Win and Keep Customers with Facebook, Tips for Local Businesses. Drew over 5,000 people. Then the next one was on standards and compliance. This is for engineers, designing and verifying safety instrumented systems. Then there's one for life sciences it was a tutorial and standards on how active rehab protocols reduce post-operative recovery time. This is on using devices for athletes getting back who've had surgery. The one that says culture shock, shake up your company, your store, your people, and sales increases will follow, was a tutorial given by a very dynamic sales trainer in retail sales. The next one was a case study, Smarter Streets. This was about how the city of Baltimore and Washington Gas reduced cost, delivered by representatives from the city and Washington Gas. And finally, this last one we just did not too long ago was fascinating. It's to help companies who have virtual teams that are geographically dispersed. And this was a case study on how Merck was using virtual team building to increase performance. So all of these are examples of topics that win. These are must-have. They rise above the noise, and they delivered on what they were promising the audience they would get. Of course, there's no shortage of great content sources, from industry analysts, white papers, case studies, clients, partners, and publishers. There's nothing out there that can't be used to breathe life into a webinar. And I always quote what the Content Marketing Institute says, that the real objective of the webinar is to make your buyers more intelligent, is to educate them with the ultimate objective of driving profitable customer action. Joe, did I say that okay?
You said that perfectly.
Good. And that's really what it's all about. So, moving on from topics that connect and the importance of them, one of the most important things is knowing and understanding KPIs, especially as they become predictors for the success before, during, and after the webinar. And it lets you know if you're on track, or worse, if you're not. I think it's safe to say the only thing worse than bad news is bad news late. How can you fix it? So being able to keep a pulse on what's going on really gives you insights for producing predictable outcomes. And I'm going to show you a few of these that I take to the bank with me on every webinar I've done. It's never let me down yet. But one of the biggest questions I always get is, well, I want to go beyond my house list. Can you tell me what type of numbers I need and what type of registration I can expect? So if you want to go beyond your house list, these are some target benchmarks that I've used as I call back of the envelope. If you want to be able to register between 125 and 250 people, you need to have at least 50,000 contacts that have the right job function that match the webinar value proposition. They're the right company, the right organization, the right geography. And if you email them 3 weeks before you go live with a rhythm of 4 to 5 spaced drips or email blast, you will get 1/4 to 1/2 of 1% to register. Now, sometimes your mileage will vary and you'll struggle to get to the 125 other times, as in the case of that Sandstone where they had Merck as the case study. We had over 500 people because it really talked to their pain. Then from an attendance standpoint, you can figure that about 40% of the people that register will attend live, or 50 to 100. So this is a very important metric to keep in mind. But drilling down, there's key email metrics for the invitation, and there's key performance metrics for the webinar. Let's start with the email invitation metrics. If you're using a marketing automation platform, this is pretty easy to obtain. But the first criteria is how many emails were sent, less how many were bounced, how many were delivered, how many were open, how many were clicked on, and how many were unsubscribed or opted out or considered spam. We spent a lot of time going through this, and there's critical numbers in here, but these are important metrics. The webinar metrics really are above and beyond the email metrics. Now, when I started doing this about 7 or 8 years ago, none of this really existed, and I've kind of codified it and put it together. And these are 6 key performance metrics that you use across the webinar. The most important one that I'm going to go to in a moment is the click-through ratio. But as importantly, there's the attendance ratio of how many people registered actually attended. There's the use of online polls to let people weigh in and measure engagement. There's exit surveys to find out what they liked, how it met their expectations, what else they'd like to learn. Audience retention is critical. I want to see 80% of my peak audience still on at the start of Q&A. And then, of course, the content marketing gift that keeps on giving are on-demand viewings. How many people who didn't register for the webinar or who didn't attend actually viewed it? All of these are critical metrics that can help you in understanding how you're connecting with your audience. But let's take a moment and look at the click-through ratio. I absolutely believe this is the gold standard. And the click-through ratio is not how many people click on your email. It's how many people come to your registration landing page and how many actually register. That's what it measures. It's a percentage. And what it predicts is what kind of registration you'll have, what kind of attendance. It lets you know if your registration and landing page are working. It also validates your message and value prop. And how you know, in many ways, beyond just how many people register, is the percent. If you look at the 3 different balls on there, I like to see about 25% as a click-through ratio. So if 100 people come to your landing page, 25 will register. If you're under 20%, you're probably struggling. There's something probably wrong, and I'm going to give you an example of that. If you're in the green and you're 35% or more, you got a winner. You're really connecting with your audience. They want to hear what you have to say, and that's a good sign, and it's also going to drive more attendance. But what do you do when a campaign isn't performing? How do you save it from flatlining? Well, this is an actual example of a campaign we did a few years ago. And the client wanted to show their engineers, who were their customers, how they could improve their performance and bottom line by using composites. Now, if you're not in the manufacturing world, composites are a type of material that are very lightweight. Everybody knows that they're used in airplanes, but they also can be used for legacy applications such as bridges and things like that. So we put this together. We had 2 excellent speakers, and everything looked great. We did our first email blast. We had an 11% open rate. That was fantastic. Our unsubscribes was pretty low. The second one, we had about a 5.65% open rate, but we had about an 8% open rate for the whole campaign so far. Very low unsubscribe rate, which meant to us that, okay, they may not have been interested, but we're targeting the right audience. Anything under 1% is fine. But after 2 weeks, we only had 32 people registered. Our click-through ratio was 2%. If you remember from what I just said, under 20%, single digit says you have a problem. I've never seen anything like this. So we regrouped. Here was the diagnosis. Because of the metrics we had, we reviewed all the messaging. And you know what we found out? The landing page actually sounded like a sales pitch. And why? Not that these speakers we had weren't excellent speakers, but what they were really representing was selling testing software. That wasn't connecting with the audience. The audience, when they got to the landing page, said, nope, this sounds like a sales pitch. So we regrouped and started all over. And I suggested that we needed to get a credible third party to come in and talk about the business advantage of composites. So we were able to recruit an editor from Composites World, which is a well-known journal for plastics. We relaunched with a new messaging plan and subject lines. And I want to show you what happened. If you look in the upper part of the screen with a circle, it says webinar, and what we put in the subject line was Composites World Editor discusses the business case for composites. So boom, when someone got this in their inbox, they saw that it was coming from someone who was a credible third party. We changed the title to the business case for composites. In the second red circle, we said join our experts, including the editor and these 2 other experts who were already signed up for this. And then we had them as a media sponsor. We had their logo. This provided a tremendous amount of lift for the campaign. So because we had the metrics, we were able to make these changes. And here were the outcomes. Using the same list, we ended up registering 638 people. We reached 69 countries. We improved the click-through ratio 11 times to 22%. The attendance was about 35% of 124. And usually when you're going outside of the 4 time zones of North America, it's hard to hit 40%. But considering we got this, we were thrilled. But most importantly, the audience gave the webinar 96% attendee satisfaction, that it met, was above average, or exceeded their expectations. So this was an example of how using metrics, click-through ratios, open rates, and everything helped us diagnose this before we had a problem that we couldn't pull out of. Let's go to the third prescription. You know, when I asked you how many invitations you get, it not only illustrates that you get a lot of invitations, but sometimes people get invitations and they're not sure, or they open it up and they haven't taken action. So we have the fence sitters. You've probably dealt with people like this. They're not sure. Maybe they'll go, maybe they won't. But what can we do to gently persuade them to go? Well, I want to show you a tactic that works very well. And what this tactic is to send a text email, not an HTML with all the branding, and only send it to the people that opened their email but did not register. So here's an example. In the subject line, we put webinar. Mike, we noticed you didn't complete your registration to learn how 2 emerging and 2 global brands transform their webinars to drive new business. And then it says, hello, Mike. We're reaching out to let you know that there's still time to register for this timely webinar on Thursday, so please be sure to reserve your space today. Now, what happens is nothing short of magnificent. When they get this, we will find, because they recognize the webinar, they recognize that the open rates will go to 30 to 50%. Think about that. 30 to 50% of the people will open their email. Now, this is counterintuitive when I tell you this, that when you do a campaign, your opt-outs, your unsubscribes actually decrease with each drip. It goes down. And so what you're able to do with doing this kind of an approach using open-only touch points is you're able to add new registrations. Now, there's a risk. The risk is that some of the people will be annoyed. I will tell you that right now. So you may see your unsubscribe rate increase a little bit. However, if you're doing all the right things and following the best practices and keeping your unsubscribe rate under 1%, then go for it. What you have to win is getting more people to attend your webinar. The 4th prescription is making your speakers rock stars. How do you make them shine? And again, using the theatrical approach, we do what we call table reads and dress rehearsals. Remember, your speakers are very busy people. They have a day job. Their day job is to do whatever it is they do. Yes, they're gracious enough to speak on your webinar, but they have other things on their mind. So we need to help them and coach them and make sure they have the right amount of slides and they're visual and that they understand what the audience is interested in. So here's an example of a webinar we did almost just about a year ago with DHL, who has a supply chain logistics. This was a compliance and standards issue. There was a whole new way that the business paradigm for pharma and medical devices is being changed through a process of what's called serialization, tracking it through the life cycle. Obviously, DHL is not in the pharma business or the medical device business, but they want to be the trusted partner to those companies that are, and they want to get in early. So they wanted to promote their thought leadership on helping the industry understand all this confusion and change. And so we helped them bring on 2 people that were experts. Pat, who was an expert in working the law, and Lisa, who was an expert consultant. Again, a wealth of knowledge, very, very busy people. How do we help them prepare for understanding what the audience wants? Well, one of the most important things that you can do on your registration landing page is ask, what do you want to learn? And here's why. You will uncover fresh ideas that are timely and relevant for engaging with your audience. And I'll give you an idea of what that looks like. But also, what's more important is your invitation is the promise of what you will deliver, and it's your contract with the audience. So you want to make sure that people who are signing up for your webinar want to be there, want to learn something. How do they overcome a pain point or get better outcomes? But you want to make sure that what they want to learn is what you're planning to deliver, or if not, you've got to make some changes. So this is a snapshot, and this was for everybody that I think there were several hundred people that registered for this, but we said, what would you like to learn? And then on the right-hand side is their job title. If you look at this, they wanted to learn about trends. How does this impact global issues? There were recurring themes, and we bucketed this. And then we went back to our speakers, and we said, these are the things that they really want to understand. They really want to understand, what is this law? So they made very sure to explain what the law is, that it's a national system for tracing pharmaceutical products, and they gave examples, and they stayed on message. They also talked about how the U.S. trends impact regulations and product integrity issues in other countries. So it was a combination of getting what do you want to learn with them being able to focus their message. This is so important that you give your speakers this. And you know what? As busy as your speakers are, and I know there's always someone who says, well, how do you get them to give up time to to work in a table read and a dress rehearsal, it's simple. You show them that you've got their back. You encourage them. When they know that you want them to be successful, they appreciate the time, and it helps them do a better job in delivering the message. My fifth prescription is using life cycle intelligence for post-webinar follow-up, because the webinar is the easy part. Once the webinar is over, now the real work begins. And who that attended the webinar may be sales ready, who needs additional nurturing, and what do I need to send them? Or maybe they're just not a fit. Now's the time when the analytics and the KPIs come in. I'm just giving you some examples of some of the way we track, and we suggest you track to get a profile of your audience. What kind of industries are being represented? What are their levels? How many professionals are in their firm? This is for a firm that uses automated time tracking. What were their areas of interest? You know, what do they want to learn? What state are they from? And what was the registration source? So this gives a little bit of an idea of your audience. And then if I can just get my mouse over here, here it is. We put together, I recommend you put together an executive summary of the KPIs and analytics. Now this is just a snapshot. If you look at the green bounding box, each one of those are a tab behind a spreadsheet or a pivot table where you have detailed information on registration, email campaign summary, how did people vote in polls, what were their responses, what live questions were asked, where did the lead come from, profile of them, what kind of, what do they want to learn. So you have a whole way of understanding how your webinar went through the life cycle. And this is enormously valuable for follow-up contact, and I'll show you how. But the real question, beyond educating, did the webinar move the attendee's intent to purchase? Now this is from an actual client that does a very, very technical webinar. Oh, and by the way, they're 90 minutes long, 2 breaks, 2 Q&A sessions, not 60 minutes. And the question is asked at the end of the webinar in a survey, not during it. Having attended today's webinar, your plans to purchase or acquire products or services, how did it change? Look at that. 47% said it increased. 24% said they were just researching, but now they intend to acquire. 24% were researching, but they don't see a need. 5 decreased. 71% are all of a sudden interested in learning more. They're saying, yeah, tell me something, help me. I'm on this trajectory. So in taking the attendee insights, and again, this is just a snapshot of some of the dashboard summary and the analytics that we provide. If you look at this in the first row there, this person had an interest in a particular type of technology. What were their plans to purchase this year? Wasn't sure, just researching. The person below said yes. Okay, what would you like to learn? Identified the area. They rated the webinar a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, so you know they enjoyed it. They liked it. It wasn't too technical. It was well organized. What other topics are you interested in? GPS signal related topics. And how they voted in the second poll. They found that defining models for initial sensor areas was important. And there was a question. Now I'll tell you something, Joe. If this were you, this would really make it easy for me to give you a call or to send you some information and have a warm conversation, because I already know a few things about you that I can have a conversation about. And so the benefit of tracking these type of insights before, during, and after is that it absolutely helps you optimize your outcomes, and it enables a warm sales or nurturing follow-up. You know what to say to them. You know what to send. And if they're not interested, you leave them alone. So this is an example of using attendee insights for everybody that either registered or attended your webinar.
Well,
But I think it's also
to just interrupt for a second, Mike, what's so key about this is that you're not wasting salesperson's time either, because that's the biggest thing that I see where you get, hey, you think that all contacts that attend a webinar are leads of some kind, and they're not. You were just talking about that, and you only want to give the sales team the ones that are ready to go with this kind of data. instead of just saying, hey, we had 200 people show up, here you go. And I think a lot of people are still doing that, and I think that we've got the data right now. We need to move away from that mentality.
Absolutely. And you know what? If somebody says, my plans to purchase this year is yes, call them. They'll be happy to take your call. And you can have, I like to say, you have a warm conversation. You're not just calling like disinterested and trying to sell them something. You're trying to have a conversation with them. But thanks for pointing that out, Joe. What I also want to talk about, I think one of the most important things about webinars is effectiveness. My personal goal, and I know it's the goal of Content Marketing Institute, is to make content marketers more effective. And some of the ways that webinars can impact your demand gen goals to be more effective is that obviously net new deals is a no-brainer. Okay, that's real easy to show the ROI. But you know what? Not everybody, again, is sales ready. They're on that journey. But also measure how many people who were prospects that attended your webinar were you able to convert into customers? And how were you able to upsell and cross-sell to your existing base? Measuring how you increased your sales pipeline. And I think the other thing, it puts you on the map as a viable player, and it helps you reach new markets and geographies. I mentioned that company, Sandstone, that did the case study with Merck. The interesting thing is they're headquartered in Nottingham, England, and they wanted to expand their footprint in the States. They got 548 people to register for that webinar and a lot of follow-up. And they were able to reach new markets and geographies without having to get on a plane or in a car. And so these are some ways that I encourage every marketeer to look at ways to validate how webinars impact your bottom line. It's not just closing new deals. So let me summarize with my call to action on what you need to do to help attract and convert your prospects into your advocates and customers. And again, the three parts of the life cycle are attracting, and I've given you some ideas, to how to engage and how to convert. I'll give you a couple ideas. Most importantly, identify trends and disruptions in your industry. Look at the challenges. Become the expert and use your thought leadership or the thought leadership of speakers to educate your audience on the opportunities and how they can overcome these pain points and get better outcomes. And you must have topics. I would bet that most of those invitations that you get, you don't take action on because they're not a must-have, or they don't directly appeal to you. Must-have topics. That's what people want. How do I get rid of pain? And then if you use content that demonstrates real business outcomes that you can tell a story around, that's the greatest thing. We did this last week at Content Marketing World. We talked about how a client, actually the client was there, used a case study to grow their business. It's very, very engaging and believable. A couple other ideas, and I can't overstate how important this is. Find and recruit third-party speakers who know their stuff and are passionate. You want that enthusiasm to come across and connect with your audience because, again, unlike last week where I got to see real live breathing people in front of me, it's just my voice that connects with you. And it's important to have that in your speakers. The KPIs, in fact, Joe, you and I, one of the first webinars we did together was on metrics. And I'll tell you where you can get that as a slide share. This is so important, understanding metrics, how they help before, during, and after. And they're absolute predictors of your outcomes. The last one may sound like mom and apple pie, but I'll tell you, you have to have a project plan. You have to follow a methodology. Because if you fail to plan, I guarantee you plan to fail. You cannot wing this. Anyone who thinks that build it and they will come, or I'm a great presenter, I'll just show up and wing it, ain't going to happen. You've got to work this plan as though it's one of the most important events you're ever going to do. So what I'd like to do now is just to give you a couple of ways to continue the conversation, and then we'll take some questions, Joe. We have on our website, there are case studies, we have a blog, there are also complimentary ebooks, and in just a moment, Alna's going to give you an opportunity if you're interested to get the art of producing webinars that work. We also have on LinkedIn a thought leadership group on webinars and webcasts with about 1,100 people. You can reach me at Webinar Ready. And also, if you go to SlideShare and you search WebAttract, there's a lot of presentations online. And if you don't see what you want, just let me know. If I have it, I'll get it for you. Now, what I'm really excited about is that finally we are this fall announcing and releasing for early adopters a 8-module course on how to produce demand generation webinars to become a certified master webinar producer. Everything I talked about today is in there and more. And this is full of exercises that gives you real life experiences to develop and become a master webinar producer. So I hope you'll have an interest in that. You'll let us know. Joe, I'm now going to turn it back to you, and I'm ready for any questions. I want to thank everybody for their attention, and shoot them over as soon as you got them.
Sounds good. Mike, thank you so much. As always, I learned something new, even though I feel like I've heard you talk quite a few times. I always learn something new. Everyone on the webinar right now, wherever you're calling in from, now is the time to ask your questions. We've got questions coming in right now, but we want to get to as many as we possibly can. I believe we have about 15 minutes for questions, and we're going to get to these. So please go ahead and ask your questions right now. I've got a couple of these coming in. I specifically want to talk about, there's some questions about a follow-up email after the webinar. And I know you didn't go in depth through that, Mike, but could you just talk about best practices once a webinar is over? What should that follow-up or that thank you email be? And, what's the next steps when you do that?
Thank you for the question. Within 24 to 48 hours, a thank you email should go out to everybody who attended and everybody who registered but didn't attend. And it should have a brief summary of thank you for attending our webinar on 5 prescriptions. We hope you found it of value. We covered the following with Joe and Mike. If you'd like to learn more, click here for a on-demand viewing 24/7. So you want to include a link to the recording. I like to take it a step and edit out unnecessary housekeeping or any ums and ahs so they can view it. The second thing is to invite them how they can get more information. If you'd like to learn more, click here, go to this website, whatever. It should encourage them to continue the conversation. Now, that's to the attendees and to the registrants. Sorry you weren't able to join us. This is what we covered, but here's some resources that are available for you. I also believe that after that's done, it makes good sense to do a nurturing campaign based upon analyzing the analytics and what other topics people are interested in, and provide them some information, not to sell them, but to provide them maybe a white paper, maybe a case study, to provide them some information. But to answer the question, Joe, 24 to 48 hours is when that thank you email should go out.
No, I think when you think about repurposing too, because you briefly touched on that, that's so important, because I think most people just think, hey, the webinar is a webinar, we're done, we'll nurture where we can, and we're on to the next one. But if you really have amazing piece of content like you're recommending to do with the type of content and the type of speakers that you're getting, you could say, hey, could this be a blog post? Could this be a slide share? Could this be, could we cut this up into mini podcasts? But I think that the core is, and we've talked about this before, Mike, is planning for this ahead of time instead of just saying, oh, okay, now what do we do? But if you plan for it ahead of time and then you can create the right structure around it, I think you've got something valuable.
Absolutely. And, a client said to me, and it was great, when we got the on-demand he got the on-demand webinar, he says, you know what? This is the content marketing gift that keeps on giving. I go, I like that. So you're absolutely right, Joe. And I think, for everybody, just to make the point, when I showed great sources of content, a 1.5 page case study is 2 webinars. I guarantee it, to do it right. And so the challenge here is, how do you become a content marketer that understands the assets you have and to slice and dice it and serve it up in different ways? Because I'm convinced people learn not just from a linear way. The webinars, one, podcasts, sound bites, whatever. So yeah, absolutely, Joe.
Very good. Now, before I get to the next question, Mike, we had Kimberly and a couple others ask, what does a KPI stand for? And I answered a few of these, but do you want to answer?
Thank you. KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. It is another way of saying metric, but thank you for asking that question. I'll make sure when I mention KPIs, I do it. It's just a key performance indicator.
Well, you and I are in the weeds on this. We see KPI and don't think anything of it. So,
well,
no, that's a great question. Thank you, Kimberly. A very popular question here from Katie. Which day of the week is the best day to host a webinar?
In the B2B world, there are 3 days. Tuesdays, like today, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I like the same time that Adobe and CMI are using today, which is 11 a.m. West Coast, 2 p.m. East Coast. Now, Katie, let me say this, that my personal preference is I like Thursdays as one of my favorite days. And the reason is, come Thursday, people have already dealt with all the fires for the week, all the headaches. They're more relaxed. Tomorrow, Friday is the start of the weekend. However, if it is really solid content and people want to learn it, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday will work. They will make a way to come to your webinar. So those are the 3 days.
So Maria's asking this question, Mike, and this is your concept of confusion plus change equal opportunity, and she'd just like you to elaborate on that concept. Confusion plus change equals opportunity.
Okay, here's the way I look at it. When there is confusion on something that's going on in an industry, I'll give you a perfect example. A couple of years ago, Canada came up with a whole new way of regulating sending emails unless people had expressly asked to have the email. Well, that created confusion to people like me. It also meant change. We were changing something. I was extremely interested. What is all this? What am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? The opportunity was somebody put on a webinar explaining what that meant. And so when I say confusion plus change equals opportunity, it's as much the opportunity for you as a webinar producer to say, well, what are the trends in my industry? What's going on? What's changing? How can I get ahead of that? If I'm feeling this, I bet you other people are feeling this too. How can I show them a way that can demystify this, that can give them a roadmap to get through it? Joe, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that was perfect. I mean, it's just, when you're talking about pain points especially, I mean, that it's amazing to me in just seeing the amount of webinars and just frankly, just the amount of content marketing that's out there, how much of what one company does sounds exactly like another opportunity. I think, or another piece of content from another company. And I think what we really want to look at is, are we telling a differentiated story? That's your way of talking about it is a way to get to how are we telling a differentiated story, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, if we can just, let's riff for a moment what we learned last week during one of the keynotes at Content Marketing World. I don't know if it was you who said this or Robert said it, but somebody said, and I completely agree, the risk is the more people do something, the more it becomes commoditized. And you've got to separate yourself from the rest of the pack and do something different.
Yep. Jay Bear was on stage and talked about that.
Right.
Well, basically said we're all getting to become experts at this content thing, and so we're all going to have to step up our game, and talked about how important passion is and all this. But I think the real key is, and we do this in a lot of our exercises for a lot of these big enterprises, we take their content and we print out different pieces of it, whether that's a webinar deck or whether that's a blog post or a white paper, and we take their branding off of it, and we see if they can actually figure out whether it's theirs or not. They usually say, oh, this is really good. This is amazing. This is exactly what we want to do. And then we say, well, that's your competitor's content. They don't, you're not telling a different story. You're basically creating the same content as your competitors are. And it's really hard to do, but you have to do it today. You want people to look at your headlines, you look at your webinar titles and say, I know that's Adobe. I know that, whatever that company is, I know that because that's the story that they're trying to, that's my emotions are geared toward that. Let's get through some other questions,
Sure.
Mike, on this one. So Kate's asking, from your experience, which works better, a 30-minute or a 1-hour length webinar?
Love that question, Katie. I think the way you look at that is, what are you trying to present? And what I mean by that is, if it's something that can be done in a half an hour, do it in a half an hour. And that could be a tutorial or a best practice. And half an hour gives you an opportunity to welcome the audience, to set up why they're there, what you want them to learn, and give them an opportunity to ask questions. 30 minutes is great. What we usually find is when there is a need to go beyond just one practice or best practice and tell a story, such as a case study, you need the hour webinar, because if you think about it, you probably had, and today's a perfect example, 2 to 3 minutes of an introduction that Joe did, a little time for a poll, maybe there's 25 to 30 minutes of on-air time, or and then you want to leave time at the end for Q&A. It's so an hour webinar for what we're doing today, giving ample time to ask questions is extremely important. I would never want, in fact, it drives me nuts if someone tries to just talk for 58 minutes and says, okay, we'll take your questions. People are frustrated. Maybe they really got value, but they got to go to their other meetings. So part of working with your speakers, if you do table reads, is to find out how much content they have. Look at your invitation. This is what we promise we deliver. We have these 3 deliverables, or whatever it is. If you can get it done in a half an hour, nobody is going to be upset if you get off the stage while you're hit. But if you need more time, you can do up to an hour, and people will engage if you're giving them good value. So that's the way I look at it. But most webinars we do are 60 minutes.
While you're talking about speakers, Mike, a speaker, as you know, can make or break your webinar. What are some tips for how you can motivate your speakers to really want to give their all?
What I believe is that, because what we do in webinar land is all virtual, you have to create trust and a bond with your organizers and speakers. And one of the ways that you can get your speakers to give it their all is to show them that you mean business. You're there to support them. You have a meeting, they have an agenda. They know what's expected. You don't waste their time. You start the meeting on time, you help them. And as you're doing that, they realize, hey, these guys got my back. These guys have a professional approach. All right, I'll hang out a little bit longer. I'm not gonna fight the fact that they want me for an hour, hour and a half. That's one way. The second way is to make them part of the process, is to share with them the information from the audience. What do you want to learn? If you make people part of the process, then they own it. And believe me, they want to look good. It's their 15 minutes of fame. So I think it's a combination of a lot of using white gloves and being a concierge and just really nurturing and taking care of them.
I've got a couple questions here, Mike, on email, the critical email question. Can you run through your best practices for when and how many emails that you should send optimally? I know you went through this a little bit, but it's such an important question. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So here's the best practice. 3 weeks before you go live, you want to send your first blast or touch point or drip, whatever you want to call it. I said that the life cycle is about 8 weeks, and you need the first 4 weeks or so of planning, of understanding your demographic, understanding your messaging. But you want to be tested, run that through, and 3 weeks before you go live, send your first blast. And then measure the results. What kind of open rates did you get? What type of unsubscribe rates? What's your click-through ratio? So on and so forth. And then what we do is we like to go over that 3 weeks with 4 or so more drips. Now, after you send the first drip, and either you could either test to a small part of the audience, or you're going to send it to all of them. The second drip is sent suppressing all the people that opened the email but didn't take action, as well as the people that registered. And then I'd wait 3 or 4 days, again, looking at your metrics. Your metrics is your dashboard. It tells you, what you need to do. It tells you if your subject lines are working. It tells you everything. send your third drip, and then your fourth drip. And so by the time you get to showtime, you have one last email to do either 2 days or the day before, which is a hurry, last chance to register. In the book, and of course, obviously in our courses and in one of my other books, Webinar Ready, I go through how to do that. But it's a science. It's an art and it's a science. So 4 to 5 is what I would recommend 3 weeks before you go live. Suppress all the people that registered. Don't hit the people that opened it until the very end. Leave them alone. And make sure that you're changing up your subject lines, because the subject line is the first thing that people see in their inbox. If they don't like the subject line, no way are they going to open up your invite. And again, make sure it's very clear that it's a webinar. And if you've got, here's a great best practice, if you've got a known speaker, put their name in it. Like we did editor of Composites World. People recognize that. If I was doing a webinar with Joe Polizzi, I guarantee you his name would be in there. I just put Joe Polizzi on the invitation and people would come. How's that, Joe?
I don't know if that would work, Mike. You know, the last thing on that one, the thing that really worked for us is sending a reminder email to those that have registered the day of.
Oh yeah.
Which is critical.
And actually, thanks for bringing that up. Yes. Most email marketing platforms or webinar platforms will automatically send up a reminder. Thank you. And that should go immediately upon signing up to get a confirmation. And then a week before the webinar, a day before the webinar, or an hour before the webinar, remind them. Yeah, absolutely. But I was talking about the outward bound of getting people to register. But great point.
No, you're exactly right. And I want to get this one in, Mike. We have 1 minute before I'm going to send it over to Alna here. Mary's asking, you know, you talk about this idea of the theatrical component, you know, that people want to feel something emotional. I guess Mary's asking, is that realistic? Can you put a metric around that? I mean, when most webinars are sort of, I don't want to say boring, but most of them are, and we need to do a lot better at this. What would be your take to that about adding this, you know, theatrical nature to your webinars?
Well, I think part of it is good pacing. We always use a moderator. Audiences want a dialogue, not a monologue. So having a good moderator that's strong, that gets you off to a great start is important, and tease things up. So you don't want death by PowerPoint. But the way, when I say make it theatrical, is have the speakers comfortable so they can be as authentic and get their passion out. And they're not worried about advancing their slides. They're not worried about stuff. They're just focusing on their message. That's what I mean by theatrical. To make it a radio show, make it engaging, make it two people talking like you and I are. They don't sound scripted. They sound real. That's what you can do. And believe it or not, some of the driest topics have some of the most interesting speakers behind it. That's what I mean by theatrical, is to make it engaging where the audience wants to lean in and listen, having them properly mic'd, using the right devices. There's a slew of things to do, but that's the primary thing, is if somebody can be natural and authentic and come from their own experience and doesn't sound like they're reading, that's 90% of the battle.
Mike Agron from WebAttract, thank you so much, sir. It's always a pleasure being on these webinars with you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Adobe. And folks, thank you so much for your interest in being on here today. I really appreciate it.